Okay, great. So usually we give welcome everybody who is here. We usually give people a couple of minutes to kind of join us. I'm going to go and put my slides up. And today our icebreaker was going to be, what is a way that you like to relax or have some self-care for yourself? As we get into the fall and winter, I always think it's important to take care of ourselves. And so I'm wondering if people want to just share what their favorite way to unwind is, relax, and to show yourself some self-love. So if you want to put those in the chat, you're welcome to. And I think we'll give people about 3 minutes or so before we kind of start. But I know that for me personally, I love to read a good book, to listen to some music. That's kind of my favorite way to unwind. I recently did hear that going for a walk, yes, that's also a really important way to unwind. I did hear that candles are not as great for us to be using indoors. Apparently, there's, like everything else, they can be bad for you. So it used to be putting on a nice candle, but going for a walk sounds great, especially this weekend. It's going to be very nice out in the DC area. Give people about another minute before we jump in. Like I said, this is being recorded and we do post it on our YouTube pages for everyone to kind of take a look, and I can pass along slides as well. We appreciate everyone coming. It's nice to see everybody today on this nice Tuesday. If you want to go and put in the chat just some of the things that you do to like to unwind, to show yourself some self-care, I'm going to share with the group and get some other ideas maybe of ways that you like to unwind. A couple more people joining us. So we give people a chance. I know we're usually scheduling ourselves back to back to back with this virtual world. So I want to make sure hiking, pedicures, hot tub, I'm all about those. Cassie, thank you for sharing that. Nature documentaries, H just posted, I love a documentary. It feels like I'm getting educated while relaxing. 2 birds with 1 stone. Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We will kind of just jump in and get started since we only have about a half an hour together. So I want to use our time wisely. But thank you all for joining us. This is our Broadband Bites for Lunch in October. We're so happy to have you today. Just a little review of last month. So last month's segment, we were honoring Hispanic Heritage Month, which was in the middle of September through mid-October. We heard from from Christine Nieves from the Senior Vice President of Development from Esperanza. And we had some great updates from her and just felt very thankful for her to share some of her work in community work that they do at Esperanza. So that was last week. Again, if you weren't able to join us last month, please go onto our YouTube site, Next Century Cities on YouTube, and you can see all of our Broadband Bites for Lunch series there. But this month, we're going to be talking about digital inclusion within Indigenous communities, so broadband access and Native nations. I'm going to quickly go over a little bit of background on Indigenous Peoples Day, do a quick federal and state headlines and highlights for you all. But the majority of today, I really wanted to leave to our special guest, Trostle, who is here with us. They're the Senior Policy Analyst for the Center of Indian Country Development at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. So we're so excited to have them here with us today, and I'm going to leave the majority of time for them to share about their important work. But quickly, just wanted to dive into a little bit about Indigenous Peoples Day, typically celebrated on the second Monday in October, replacing Columbus Day. And unfortunately, it is not currently recognized as a federal holiday. However, there are 21 states and growing that are currently honoring Native Americans with a holiday one day during the year. There are over 600 Native nations in the United States, And that makes for approximately 6.8 million people in the United States that identify as Native American, which is essentially 2% of our entire population, which is a large number of individuals in America who are who identify as Native American. And so it's important that we understand Indigenous Peoples Day, the history behind it. And I would, I'm open to having H share some of their perspective, but from some of the research I gathered, and just from talking to people, we know that the advocates are saying that this is a great way for us to correct a whitewashed history of American history that glorified Columbus, who actually committed extreme violence against Indigenous communities. And so we want to reframe the narrative to be focused on celebrating Indigenous people and their communities and moving away from Columbus Day. So it's great to be able to do that and to honor and share all the strength that they are bringing to our country and to their native lands. I also wanted to highlight the Native Land Digital, which is a great interactive tool where you can go on and see where all the Indigenous groups and Native nations are around the whole planet. So it's a great interactive tool. They said it's not perfect, but it does have a lot of information that's great for people to kind of get an idea of where they are, where all these Native nations are around the world. I also just felt it was important to include this quote from First Nations that says, we believe that every day is Indigenous Peoples Day. Every day is a time to remind others about the factual history of Native people. Every day is the right time to honor Native culture, strength, and fortitude. And every day is an opportunity to tell the world we are here, we are still here, and there is much cause for celebration. So although we only are highlighting Indigenous Peoples Day one day in the month of October, it's important for us to understand that this is important in all days, that we remember the factual history of Native people, and unfortunately some of the ways that they have not been highlighted or utilized. And so we hope that we can kind of change that going forward. So before I let H take the stage, I do want to give a couple federal and state headlines for us. I know it's a quick kind of jump into what's going on, but we did recently just have 30 Democratic senators send a letter to the Senate for continued funding for the Affordable Connectivity Program. I've listed those senators here, but just an excerpt from the letter is, should ACP funding not be extended, millions of Americans could be at risk for losing access to broadband. So we're very excited to have some support in the Senate. And for those that are watching, if you are affiliated with your local government, your local municipalities, please continue to try to push them in the right direction of refunding the ACP and signing on to letters such as that. On the state side, we do have more states submitting their plans for Volume 2 for the BEAD process. I have linked all of the states here with their Volume 2 plans that I'm happy to share. I'm going to be sharing the slides after our, later this week after our session. But if you want to get an idea of what's going on in real time, Corianne and other members of NCC have been really working hard to put together a snapshot that you can see here that's linked at our Next Century Cities page that gives an idea of what states are submitting what pieces of the BEAD process, when and what dates they have to do so in that time. So it's a great snapshot for anybody who kind of wants to have an idea of what's still going on in the BEAD process, because I know there's a lot of information there. So without any further ado, I wanted to welcome H. Trostle to the conversation. They're a senior policy analyst at the Center for Indian Country Development at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, doing some great research. And so we wanted to be able to give them a opportunity to share some of the work that they're doing. We are going to end with a question and answer segment. So if there are any questions that you have for H or for myself or want to share in this conversation, please go ahead and put those in the chat, save them for later, and please just unmute yourself during the question and answer because we'd love to hear from you. But before that, I want to hand it over to H and allow them to share.
Awesome. Thank you. Let me just share my screen. It'll take me a hot second to get over to my PowerPoint. Here we are. So I'm going to give an abbreviated presentation of a talk I did at a conference recently about if there are digital equity gaps in Native American communities, using the Affordable Connectivity Program as sort of our data to explore I want to start by reminding everyone that the views expressed by myself do not necessarily represent the position of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. They are my own views, and this is my own research. So we're going to just quickly go through Tribal Broadband 101, the Affordable Connectivity Program, some data and definitions, and the preliminary results from this research. So the data that we have is pre-pandemic. 18% of people on tribal lands did not have broadband internet access. 30% of people on rural tribal lands did not have broadband internet access. So we see a disparity between people in urbanized areas and people in rural areas. One of the common misconceptions is that all tribal lands are rural, and that is not the case. Additionally, our research here at the Center for Indian Country Development found that 33% of people on rural tribal lands did not have any type of home internet service. So not only did they not have broadband, they didn't even have DSL or dial-up. And that was 21 percentage points higher than households on neighboring non-tribal lands. So one of the things that we were interested in exploring with the Affordable Connectivity Program is that the monthly subsidy for residential internet service is significantly higher on tribal lands. So we all know that in general, when we talk about the Affordable Connectivity Program, we're talking about that $30 subsidy for households. But on tribal lands, that's a $75 subsidy. This is because tribal lands have significantly higher costs associated with getting basic broadband service. And one of the things that we're interested in seeing is if this is such a high subsidy, we would expect a sort of higher participation rate in the program than on the non-tribal lands. However, we also did some interviews and focus groups with digital navigators and tribal internet service providers, and we heard about all of the problems with the Affordable Connectivity Program. Tribal IDs are being rejected by USAC. Enrollment in tribal programs like proof of enrollment in, say, like the tribal food program is being rejected. It's being viewed as like not qualified. The actual boundaries of tribal lands are in dispute because this program is for anyone who lives on tribal lands, not just tribal members. So some ISPs think it's only for tribal members and try to require proof of tribal enrollment. Other places are problems with the administering service, USAC, where someone lives on tribal lands, but they're only getting the $30 subsidy because there is dispute around that boundary of what counts as the reservation and what does not, because there are so many different definitions of tribal lands in the U.S. So there's the census defined areas, there's the Bureau of Indian Affairs defined areas, there's the areas that tribes themselves view as their tribal lands. And so those boundaries are constantly in tension. And it's really important for this program to get things right because it is like a $45 difference. And one of the other things we're hearing is that it's harder for small ISPs to participate in the program because they have to wait for that reimbursement from the federal government. And that can be even more complicated if the federal government is only reimbursing $30 when they should be reimbursing $75 per household per month. So looking at this data, we can expect that the participation rate on tribal lands would be lower. And so we have these two competing theories. Is participation rate going to be higher or is it going to be lower? And so we dove into the data. So what does this participation look like on tribal lands? Well, in order to really get into that, we have to get into the data. So we have the USAC data, it's updated monthly. We have the households at the zip code level. It doesn't really distinguish between people on tribal lands and those not on tribal lands. And then we're also combining that with Census Bureau data. So population, the family income data, the census boundaries for tribal lands. And so we've been trying to estimate participation because we have to figure out how many households are eligible. And there's so many different ways for households to be eligible. Like I mentioned, like specifically on tribal lands, that there are some tribal programs that qualify, like Tribal Head Start or TANF. And one of the things the digital navigators were saying was sometimes, even though these are qualifying programs under the law, they are still getting rejected, and it's taking longer for people to be able to get enrolled. So we're trying to estimate how many people are eligible in order to figure out how many people are enrolling, what the participation is. But we're also running into an issue around those boundaries. Like I keep returning to the boundaries of tribal lands, and our data is at the zip code level. And as you can see, it doesn't match up with the boundaries of tribal lands. On this map, you can see that the reservations are the gray hashes and the zip codes are blue, and those boundaries don't align. And so we're exploring, what counts as a tribal zip code. So we're creating these intersections. We're exploring those percentage of overlap. Should we use a 25% definition? Like if the zip code is 25% tribal, should we count it as a tribal zip code? Or should we go even farther and do 75%? And then we're exploring what counts as a neighbor. What is a non-tribal zip code that is a neighbor to a tribal zip code? So we're playing around with the distances. And if you use different definitions, you will get different answers. And then finally, the other way that we are exploring this data is looking at like zip codes. So comparing similar zip codes between tribal and non-tribal zip codes. We're including things like population density, percentage of people in poverty, percentage of those who are in qualifying programs. So there are so many different ways to parse this data. And what we're finding is that in our results, no matter which way we parse the data, the participation on tribal lands is higher. So if we look at if we go into an average tribal zip code, we'll see that the participation rate is like 33%. But if we went into just sort of an average zip code in the US, that participation rate is only 30%. So that's 3% difference in favor of tribal lands. And then if we sort of weight this, we find that the participation rate on tribal zip codes is 41% compared to sort of 36% nationally. And our numbers are just estimates, and we're still exploring the best way to estimate the number of eligible households. And so then we look at the neighboring non-tribal zip codes. And so we're exploring different definitions. Should it be 10 kilometers away? Should it be 25 kilometers away? And what we're finding is that if you only look at zip codes that are about 10 kilometers away from a tribal zip code, then there is a significant gap. And it still persists even if you remove Oklahoma from the analysis, if you remove Navajo from the analysis. We see this persistent gap between those closest neighbors and the tribal zip codes. But if we go out to, say, 25 kilometers, that difference disappears. In fact, if you go out that far, then the trend reverses itself. Instead of these non-tribal zip codes having a higher participation rate, they suddenly have a lower participation rate. And so what's going on here? So we mapped our results to sort of see what was happening. So this map shows towns, those sort of greenish, bluish greenish areas. And then it maps the zip codes over the tribal lands. So the tribal lands are in hash, the towns are in green, and then the closest neighbor zip codes are that reddish orange. And as you can see, those tend to be picking up towns. But if you look at the 25-kilometer, those slightly farther away neighbors, that's picking up more rural areas. And if you can see, the more rural areas sort of match up with tribal zip codes also being more rural. And you'll notice little things too with this map that say Laguna Pueblo up at the top is not included in a zip code. It's not included in this analysis because of the way that we defined a tribal zip code as being 50% tribal lands. And so we're seeing sort of the limitations of this neighbor analysis, and we're playing around with it a little bit more to see what different ways we can, what different results we can get. So if we were to include any overlap, if we include Laguna Pueblo, what does the result look like? And so then we went and did a different style of analysis where we're comparing the like zip codes, where we're accounting for the population density, the share of households without internet, the per capita income, and we're finding that the participation is higher in tribal zip codes than those comparable non-tribal zip codes. And so we are left with sort of what is explaining these two divergent stories. And one possible explanation is the existence of border towns. Border towns are commonly found around reservations. They are non-tribal communities that exist very much at the very edge of a reservation. And they tend to be slightly more affluent than the reservation. They're sites of economic activity. In fact, they tend to take dollars out of the tribal community, and instead of having it recircle on the reservation, those dollars go out to the towns and then go out to the wider economy. And so it's there's a lot of tension there between border towns and reservations. And so if we're looking at those nearest neighbor analyses that we did, we're seeing that the border towns light up, that they have that higher participation rate than those areas on tribal lands. And so that is like one sort of possible explanation. The other explanation is there's similarities between tribal lands and the farther out neighbors. Why if you look at only 25 kilometers, does that difference disappear completely? Why do tribal lands and their neighbors appear to be doing the same? And there's a couple different possibilities. One thing that I've been exploring is we have these tribal digital navigator programs, and they are doing so much work in tribal areas. And so they're getting people enrolled. They're getting people probably enrolled at higher rates than those comparable non-tribal zip codes where they don't have digital navigator programs. So that could explain sort of, despite all of these barriers tribal lands face in getting enrolled in this program, they still are having sort of a comparable or even higher participation rate. And if you look at that specifically by border towns don't face those same barriers, but they're getting all of that benefit from that tribal ACP outreach. And so people are better able to enroll in the program. And so that could explain that sort of disparity that we're seeing between the border towns and the reservations, and why that disappears the farther out from a reservation you go. So we're looking at all of these different possibilities to explain what's happening. And what we're finding is that substantial gap between participation in the ACP between those nearest neighbors, non-tribal zip codes, those border towns. We're finding that those tribal zip codes have more participation in the ACP than comparable non-tribal zip codes from across the U.S. And the participation on tribal lands is higher than expected. It's higher than the U.S. average. But is this program is it working to the best of its potential? Probably not. It still doesn't reach even 50% of eligible households. And there are huge digital divides on tribal lands, even with this program. So I want to highlight that these are preliminary results. The final results are subject to change. We're constantly playing with the different possibilities of how to analyze this data, and we're getting new data every month. So thank you. I want to put my contact information up here, as well as my co-author, Matt Gregg's contact information. And thank you all for coming to my presentation. So.
H, thank you so much. That was incredibly informative. I know for me personally, I'm always trying to get more informed on tribal lands, and thank you for kind of explaining the differences between, the bordering towns and kind of the differences that they make and maybe how they clash in some ways. And I really thought that was a lot of great data there. So thank you so much for sharing that, H. I have a couple of questions lined up for you. I know we only have about 5 minutes left. If anyone has any questions they wanted to ask H, please go ahead and put those in the chat. You're welcome to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. But I think I'll get started with just a couple of questions, if that's okay with you. And this might be a question that you get all the time, considering that, you're talking about the research is pre-COVID. I'm just wondering, do you have any plans to kind of look at how COVID and the numbers after that may have changed since 2020?
Yes, we are really excited about looking how the numbers have changed. Just doing some preliminary analysis, we're seeing, major increases in internet access on tribal lands. And we don't know for sure that it's caused by the Affordable Connectivity Program or caused by just the need for internet access during the pandemic. But we're really excited to continue sort of looking at the impact of this COVID era.
Yeah, especially when your data is showing that the participation numbers and the ACP are higher on tribal lands. I'm interested to see how those numbers are increasing or how they've stayed the same or just kind of the delta there. So I'm looking forward to that data. I know we only have a couple more minutes, so I guess I'll just ask you, what are some of the ways that attendees or viewers of today's segment can support your research and the work that you're doing at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis?
So I think just staying involved. We have webinars. We just finished one earlier this month about digital sovereignty and the connection between data sovereignty and network sovereignty and tribal broadband. We have some articles that are coming out. So just trying to stay informed is the most important sort of action people can take right now. Stay informed, learn about the Tribal Digital Navigator programs, find ways to plug into your local Native community. Here in Minneapolis, we have a very vibrant Native community, and other cities do as well. There's some histories around how Native peoples ended up in these urban areas that we don't need to get into, but you would be surprised at the number of Native people probably living within your own city that you could. So if you can get plugged into there and figure out sort of ways to support internet access in those urbanized Native communities, that would also be awesome.
Yeah, that's great. I'm just new into learning about the data sovereignty pieces and tribal lands, and it's fascinating and also sometimes challenging. And I'm looking forward to learning more about that. So thank you for that plug. And I think doing what you said, it's important for all of us to kind of learn more and be more educated to what's going on. I did want to take the last minute just to share. Let's see. Oops, says it was paused. Might having some issues, but just wanted to highlight that we are having Broadband Bites for lunch again next month in November 28th, where we'll focusing on saluting to military veterans and the barriers and challenges that they face, particularly. But I want to say again, thank you so much, H, for joining us today and informing us about all of your great research and data. Looking forward to hearing more about that, and I appreciate you sharing your findings with us today.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Check us out on YouTube. You can see some of our past presentations. I'll be linking this one up, which does include H's contact information that they had shared with you. And if you have any questions or want to get into contact, please feel free to reach out to me or anyone on the NCC team. We look forward to seeing you next month. Take care, everyone.